Welcome, everyone, to the fifth panel of the Carnegie Global Dialogue Series for 2021-2022. My name is Paul Haenle, and I'm the director of Carnegie China. I'm joining you from Singapore, where I'm serving as a visiting fellow at the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. And I'm delighted today to be joined by colleagues and friends, Amr Hamzawi, who is coming in from the United States, Bilahari Kausikan here in Singapore, and Dr. He Wenping calling in from Beijing. And we're going to discuss today China's growing involvement in the Middle East. This is the 10th year of our Carnegie Global Dialogue. We've hosted it at Carnegie China. It involves a series of panel discussions which examine China's evolving foreign policy and international role from the perspectives of Carnegie scholars at each of our global centers and international experts from across the globe. And today, we're going to be discussing China, Middle East, and we've got a terrific panel to discuss these issues. And let me briefly introduce them and then dive right into our discussion. From Carnegie, my colleague Amr Hamzawi, the director of the Carnegie Middle East program. Amr returned recently to the Carnegie Endowment. He previously served with the Carnegie Endowment between 2005 and 2010 as a senior associate in Washington, D.C., but he was also research director in our center, Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Amr left Carnegie to run for political office in Egypt, where he was successful and served as a member of the Egyptian parliament. He's also a former member of the Egyptian National Council for Human Rights. He's taught as a professor in a number of universities, Cairo University, American University in Cairo, and over the last several years, he's been teaching at Stanford, where he's calling in from today, I believe, at least near Stanford. We're glad to welcome Amr back to Carnegie. This time, of course, he's taking the helm of leadership over the Middle East program. Amr, thanks for joining us today, especially so early your time. Bilahari Kausikan probably needs no introduction to people who are watching the dialogue. He's joining us as the chairman of the Middle East Institute at National University of Singapore. Bilahari has had an illustrious diplomatic and academic career. While in the foreign ministry, he served in numerous capacities, including Singapore's ambassador to Russia, permanent representative from Singapore to the United Nations in New York, and ultimately served as the permanent secretary of Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Following his retirement, he stayed on to serve as ambassador at large until 2018, and today he's heading up the Middle East Institute, and we're really delighted, Bilahari, to have you join us today, so thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least is our friend Dr. He Wenping, who joins us today and has joined us several times in the past. She is a professor and senior research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She began her research and teaching career at CAS in 1989. She has served as a visiting scholar in a number of institutions around the world, including Yale, London University, Nordic Africa Institute in Sweden, BRICS Policy Center in Rio de Janeiro, just to name a few. She is the senior research fellow also at the Chahar Institute, and associate researcher in the Center for Chinese Studies of Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Formerly, Dr. He served as a council member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council of the Future of Africa. Wenping, it's great to have you back. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining us from Beijing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Before we kick off our substantive discussion, just a couple of quick points. We want to allow the audience that's watching this live to be able to ask questions. And so to do that, use the chat function on YouTube. Second, we'll post a recording of this discussion as an episode of our China in the World podcast, which you'll be able to find on all major podcast streaming platforms. So with that, let's kick off our discussion. As I mentioned, our topic today is focusing on recent developments and the future of China's Middle East relations, as well as implications of these evolving dynamics on geopolitics. China's economic and diplomatic stakes in the Middle East have grown in recent years as China becomes an increasingly global power with global interests and global influence. China is now the largest foreign investor in and trading partner with the Middle East. 1/3 of China's energy imports come from the Gulf Cooperation Council, with the largest portion from Saudi Arabia. Chinese companies buy 1/6 of GCC oil exports. They buy 1/5 of Iran's and half of Iraq's. Increasingly, many countries in the Middle East welcome the economic and diplomatic benefits that a partnership with China can provide. Earlier this year in January, foreign ministers of 7 Middle East countries visited China, including members of the GCC like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, as well as other countries like Turkey, Syria, and Morocco. The GCC countries continued ongoing discussions on the China-GCC Free Trade Agreement. Syria and Morocco signed 2 new MOUs for China's Belt and Road. And Turkey and China emphasized the two sides' growing technological cooperation. In broad terms, it appears as the United States seeks to reduce its strategic footprint in the Middle East, China looks to be stepping up its engagement in the region. Now, the recent outbreak of war in Ukraine portends further shifts in regional dynamics as countries in the region begin to navigate their own increasingly complex relations with Russia, with China, and the United States. And so I thought we would kick off our discussion here with the Ukraine crisis and the implications on Middle East geopolitics. As a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many countries in the Middle East have been forced to pursue a difficult balancing act with respect to their ties to Russia, China, and the US. One day after the invasion, Kuwait and Turkey were the only 2 countries in the region to initially sign a letter at the UN condemning Russia's invasion. Subsequently, in early March, many other countries in the regions did vote to condemn Russia: Jordan, Saudi, Egypt, the UAE, Israel, Oman. The US, for its part, of course, has led the charge with NATO allies in condemning Russia's invasion. There has been some frictions between the US and several countries in the region, notably Saudi Crown Prince MBS and UAE MBZ recently snubbed calls from President Biden in early March, yet they both reached out to Russian President Putin. So the straddling that many countries in the Middle East are undertaking with respect to the war in Ukraine resembles a similar balancing act that China has tried to pursue, highlighting the potential for increasing diplomatic alignment with China, perhaps, and countries in the region. So I want to start by giving each of you a chance to offer your own assessments. How do you see countries in the Middle East responding to the war in Ukraine? And how is this impacting their relations with China and the US? And let me start, Amr, with you, if I could.
Sure. Thank you so much, Paul. And it's a pleasure to join you and my colleagues in Singapore and China. Let me highlight a couple of points with regard to how countries in the Middle East have been responding to the Russian war on Ukraine, and how the response coming out of the Middle East does represent, to an extent, a similar response to what we are seeing in China. The first point I would like to highlight is the fact that Middle Eastern countries, and here I'm including Israel as well, so not only Arab countries, but the reference is to traditional allies of the United States in the Middle East. That group includes Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, prominently in the GCC countries, as well as Egypt, as well as Morocco. Traditional allies of the US have responded to the Russian war on Ukraine in a manner, as you were just outlining, Paul, in a manner which you could describe as hedging their bets. They did not want to condemn Russia because their military and trade ties with Russia have been on the rise in recent years since the Arab uprisings in 2011, increasingly in the last years, with the US decreasing its involvement in the region in many different ways. So in a way, they have attempted to hedge their bets, avoided condemning Russia. They condemned Russia in the General Assembly of the United Nations. However, most foreign ministries in the countries I'm referring to did put forward statements indicating their understanding of why Russia felt threatened and so on and so forth. It was quite an interesting balancing act. So I believe the number one big point which we're seeing in the region is the reluctance of traditional allies of the US to pursue what is the US position regarding the Russian war on Ukraine, and what's not only the US, but the US and the European position on the Russian war on Ukraine. Second point, in looking around the Middle East, the Chinese position has been very attractive for many countries, especially for Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, as well as Egypt, to the extent that their foreign ministries have been referencing the Chinese position as a position of neutrality, as a position of non-alignment, as a position of peacekeeping worldwide, and trying to follow suit. So in a way, this is the first time in a big international crisis where the Chinese position is being pushed forward by Middle Eastern diplomacies as a position to follow, as a position to aim for. I believe recent visits between Chinese and Arab Middle Eastern officials have indicated this to a great extent as well. And I might extend the reference here to countries which have traditionally kept very strong relations to China, Algeria, for example, in North Africa, Egypt traditionally with strong ties to China, increasingly evolving trade and military ties, and emerging military and strategic ties between the GCC countries, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia and China. So for the first time in a big international crisis, the reference in the region is not to the US position, is not to the European position, but it's to a great extent to the Chinese position. And that includes Israel too, which for its own purposes, be it coordination with Russia in Syria, or the fact, the influence of the growing diplomatic ties between Russia and Israel. Israel as well has been shying away from following the American and European position and referencing the Chinese position as an ideal position in a world of conflicts, in a world of military escalation. That reference to neutrality, non-alignment, peacekeeping objectives have been key in the region. Finally, I believe Middle Eastern countries are looking in times of economic and trade-related crises to Chinese investment and to the growing Chinese economic and trade role as an alternative. The Russian war on Ukraine has created a situation of food insecurity in the region. Most Middle Eastern countries import wheat, as you know. They are big importers of wheat. Egypt imports 85% of its wheat domestic consumption from Russia and Ukraine. The same goes for most countries in the region. And the impacted food insecurity and economic and trade insecurity is pushing the region to look to China for help as well. And that is sort of a point which I can highlight later. China conceives its role in the region as a projection of its soft power to a great extent. And this is where trade and the economy come in, but as well as developing investment opportunities for the Chinese economy. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Amr. Thank you very much. You put a lot on the table. Similar response to many countries in the region as China. You described it as sort of a hedging policy, and the Chinese position has some attractiveness. Now, Bilahari, of course, Singapore came out with its own sanctions, first time in 4 decades. Took a very strong position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's about 40 countries together between the U.S., Europe, other countries in Asia that, despite China calling them unilateral Western sanctions, these are not unilateral, they're not Western. There's, at least 40 countries together. But it sounds from Amr that the Middle East may have a different narrative, which is similar to the Chinese narrative. How do you see this?
Well, let me answer your question by putting the recent developments on Ukraine in a broader perspective and a longer term perspective. I think this is is best seen as part of a very initial response to a fundamental change in the strategic environment in the Middle East. And I can describe that best by perhaps comparing it to what happened in Asia 50 years ago, or more than 50 years ago. More than 50 years ago, as part of the process of correcting its mistake in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, the US moved from a position of direct intervention to that of an offshore balancer. And it has been quite consistent in that role for ever since. I believe something similar is happening in the Middle East as part of the US rectification of its mistakes in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The role of an offshore balancer and dealing with the offshore balancer is something that is very unfamiliar to countries in the Middle East. We in East Asia, we have had 50 years to get used, half a century to get used to it, and we know how to play this game. The Middle East is just starting. The role of offshore balancer is sometimes mistakenly depicted as a retreat or withdrawal. It is not that. It is taking a step back, but not withdrawing. The US Navy is still in Bahrain. The US Air Force is still in Qatar. US Patriot batteries engage incoming Houthi missiles in the UAE. F-22 Raptors have been deployed in the UAE. And the US has recently demonstrated it can reach out and kill terrorists when they locate them. All right. But this is all unfamiliar. The role of an offshore balancer is unfamiliar to countries in the Middle East. At the risk of some oversimplification, most of the Gulf countries and Israel, the basic strategic posture is very simple since the Second World War. Look for the strongest country and cleave to it. Now, what do you do when the strongest country has taken a step back? Not retreating, but taken a step back. And that is the larger meaning of the Abraham Accords. The larger meaning of the Abraham Accords is, well, if you guys think that Iran is an existential threat, I don't think Iran is an existential threat to me. So you better get together and deal with it. All right? And that process is just beginning. You see other little parts of this falling into place. Turkey reaching out to Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries. You see the most secret talks being conducted between Iran and Saudi Arabia and UAE with the intermediation of Oman and Iraq. And you have all these things. Now, whether they are going to amount to anything is still an open question. That is the broader context. But the fundamental issue for all these countries remains this. Who is going to provide security when the US has taken a step back? And there's no easy answer. For Israel, despite what our colleague said, in the end, there is no choice but the US. And I rather suspect that the Gulf states will probably come to the same conclusion, but much, much, much more reluctantly. Why do I say that? Who are the other major powers that could be the security provider? Russia? Well, we have seen Russian performance in the Ukraine, and I think Russia is at the limits of what it can do in the Middle East. China's footprint is growing in the Middle East, economic footprint, diplomatic footprint. And there's nothing unusual about that. China is reaching out to become a global power, and there's no reason that it should be not play some kind of role in the Middle East. But what kind of role? I don't think China is eager to replace the security provider role that the US has played for many decades in the Middle East. If I was Chinese, I wouldn't want to. You know, it has never ended well for any major power. Okay. So I think the Chinese would like, as far as possible, to keep their engagement diplomatic and economic, with an occasional weapon sale here and there and so on. But I think China also faces a fundamental dilemma in the Middle East, right? Its military footprint is bound to grow, at least its naval footprint. Because right now, the Middle East is still a very significant source of energy for China, But the energy routes from the Middle East to China are protected by whom? By the Fifth Fleet and Seventh Fleet. And that's an intolerable position to, for any major power to have your vital commodity supply lines, protected by your rival. Nobody will tolerate that. So China is bound to increase its military, its naval footprint at least, in the Gulf and along the route back to China. But that's quite a different thing from becoming a security provider, because China right now is in the enviable position of being simultaneously able to enjoy good relations with Israel, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, and with Iran. Is this sustainable over the long run? Because I don't think the cleavages, the geopolitical and sectarian cleavages that we see in the Middle East are going to go away anytime soon, despite this reaching out by Turkey and this quiet talks between Iran and Middle East, because the differences are fundamental. So sooner or later, China is going to have to make some choices, particularly since it doesn't look, the outlook for the JCPOA, for example, a revival of it seems rather uncertain. And I don't think, and a JCPOA, let's say it is something miraculous happens and we have a revived JCPOA. But that's a postponement of a nuclear Iran, not a complete foregoing of the nuclear option by Iran. Will Israel and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and indeed even Turkey, tolerate this? That's a very open question. And if they don't tolerate it, then sooner or later, you are going to have a major conflict in the Middle East over this issue. And then it is going to be very difficult in the run-up to that conflict, and certainly during the conflict, for you to simultaneously have good relations with everything. So therefore, I don't take this initial hedging as an indication of anything but just what it is, initial hedging, buying some time while you figure out these larger geopolitical movements. And of course, in the case of Saudi Arabia and UAE, there is a large element of pique in their initial response. Don't forget, these are absolute monarchies and they're used to getting their own way in everything. And they don't take kindly to being lectured on human rights. They don't take kindly to being pressured to kind of reduce oil production and so on. So I think it is premature to come to any long-term or major conclusions about what we see in these initial adjustments to the Ukraine war. I think the Ukraine war is unfortunately, alas, going to be a long war. It's not going to be over in a few days, as Mr. Putin hoped, but it's going to be a very long, drawn-out affair. And it has put China in a very awkward spot. China has been very careful in its response to the Ukraine war. But I do not think China can ever break with Russia for one very simple reason. China has no strategic partner anywhere in the world except Russia with the same strategic weight that shares its discomfort with the current international order. So it's early days yet. Let's not rush to any conclusions.
Okay, thank you, Bilahari. You put a lot on the table. I appreciate you providing a broader context and talking about the changes to the strategic environment in the Middle East and the U.S. One of the things in a high-profile speech that you gave at the Air and Space Conference in Canberra, Australia, I encourage people to read that, where you talked about the recalibration underway of the terms of America's engagement with the world. And part of that was this offshore balancing that you're referring to, and the U.S. expecting more, frankly, too, from partners and allies in terms of shouldering the burdens. You also talked about, and I'll turn to Dr. He Wenping, and China's in an awkward spot in terms of its positioning with respect to Ukraine and its strategic relationship with Russia. So I want to come back to Dr. He Wenping to talk a little bit about your perspective on how countries in the region, in the Middle East, how they are responding to the war in Ukraine. How do you see that? But we should roll right into the issues that Bilahari put on the table. And that is the security dimensions, the diplomatic dimensions of China's growing engagement in the Middle East. Traditionally, as Bilahari suggested, China's been cautious to get involved in regional disputes, as a major part of its approach to the region is to have good relations with every country in the region. And China has been reluctant to involve itself in difficult, contentious issues between countries, security or otherwise, that could ultimately negatively impact its relations with any one country in the Middle East. Nevertheless, it now has a military base in Djibouti. There are increasing arms sales to the region, including drones. They've signaled interest in having a military facility in Abu Dhabi. Chinese leaders in the past have hinted that they're willing to play some sort of diplomatic role in the Middle East peace process, though we haven't seen anything yet, but they have hinted at that. Many argue that as China's economic interests in the region grow, naturally too, so will China's diplomatic and security interests in the region grow. We heard in late April a speech at the Boao Forum by President Xi Jinping, where he unveiled his global security initiative. Much of the content of that speech seemed not to be new. We've heard many of the things in that speech, but Chinese officials and state media discussed it as a new and defining vision for geopolitics and global security. Though there's a lot of interest in what this might be. President Xi appears to be putting forward a Chinese vision for the future of Asia and the global order. One, of course, that offers alternatives to US ideas of alliances and sanctions, liberal values, and a rules-based international order. So in addition, I put a lot on your plate there, Dr. Ho Wenping, but we've got 1 hour to get through all these issues. In addition to your views on how countries in the region are responding and China's positioning, how do you see China's growing security and diplomatic role? And help us understand a little bit what this global security initiative is that President Xi has put forward.
Okay, thanks, Paul. First of all, it's a great pleasure to meet all of those friends, old and new. And also, I think because given the time constraint, I know this is just 1 hour, our workshop, and then almost half has gone. So I think I'll just go to the points, First of all, I think all those keywords we have been using right now is one is balancing act, another is hedging act. So no matter it's balancing or hedging, which means those countries, Middle East country and China, we don't want to be dragged in one, the camp or just keep distance with another one. So we want to be, independent and between. So why this kind of position? Because first of all, I think for most of the Middle East countries, finally they found this war now happening on the European continent rather than in the Middle East area. During the past, we have seen too much trouble, too much conflicts always in this Middle East area. Yeah, Syria war and Iraqi war, so on and so forth, even those terrorist activities also in that piece of land. But now the war now in European continent. So that's why I heard too much from African continent or Middle East friends. They're saying one word, very simple. They're saying this is not our war. This time, not our war. So why should we engage too much in this war? And this is number one reaction. And another reaction saying, okay, when you are mentioning this justice things, those value things, okay, UN Charter, sovereignty, territorial integrity, all those words. But some people naturally do a comparison, saying how to understand Iraqi war, Afghanistan war, all those wars before. Yeah, has been done also by those bombing, by the US, by those powerful NATO. So they have been doing a lot of other bombing. Similarly like this, now Russian has been done. So this is another, by instinct, a lot of people, not those high table talking, this is a low table coming from the people on the street. Yeah, they were naturally asking for this kind of question. So I think this is number one. They think this is not their war. And also they don't think you are morally very high because you also have double faces, even triple faces. Sometimes this face, another time, another face show up. So secondly, this hedging and the balancing act is because they are not sure, even including China, not sure what kind of world order will be, after this war. Now this war seems will becoming prolonged, not a quick-ended one. It seems ongoing. I also heard even Ukraine side or the NATO side, some saying, oh, maybe 10 years war, so blah, blah, blah. Yeah, who knows? It's going to be prolonged war or just a quick-ended war. Seems not that fast. So anyway, with the long, prolonged war, that means they struggling for another world order will be intense. And then it's not that easy to show up in a clear way. So that's why many those countries, developing countries at large, they don't want to repeat this Cold War, those scenario, saying either in my camp and then you are in another camp. So they don't want to repeat the new Cold War. So they want to take some time. Anyway, this balancing or hedging takes some time, like our ambassador just mentioned, saying take some time to look clear, what's going to happen. So who will take the upper hand, and then until that time, it's not that late. Until that time to make a final decision. If I have been forced to take sides, so no need that hurry. No need hurry, because the best interest is to take care about your own citizens. Right now, you are not some country now immediately rush to the front line and saying to show I'm here, I'm defending this, I'm defending that. Plus, sometimes you don't know the real reason yet. Lots of incidents happening, butcher, killing, and then another killing come out, and then nobody come out with who is the real killer. Some blame this, some blame that. There's no independent investigation. Anyway, so this is I think one is not clear about the world order, and then another is thinking about like in the whole area. Now they're also short of this kind of a strong sense of security. Not only one or two countries, I think the whole area, because we have to bring in the background into our consideration. The background before the war actually is already U.S. gradually disengagement with this area. Withdraw the troops from Afghanistan, and also will withdraw from Iraq also pretty soon. So it means, okay, I will go. I will go to Indo-Pacific. The Asia will be the focus. Left behind.
Been trying to do the pivot to the Indo-Pacific for quite some time. Talk a little bit, if you could, Wenping, about
China.
China sees its security and diplomatic role in the Middle East, especially against the backdrop that Bill Hart talked about, where the U.S. is wants to play an offshore balancing role, and as you said, wants to shift much of the priority to the Asia Pacific. What is China's security and diplomatic role going forward? How do you see that?
Yes, I agree. As our previous discussion said, before all the long time, we have been heard too much, and China's focus seems always on economic, trade, investment, like this One Belt, One Road initiative, also focus on trade, investment with all those Middle Eastern countries. We have been, stick to this non-interference policy also for a long, long time. We want to keep distance away from the security issue. Plus, like too many rivalry countries, Iran and Saudi, they are rivalry. So if we close with this country, and then it's not easy to deal with another country. So that's why this distance away with those security issue has been a long time there. But this little shift, I think, not started from recently. Actually, can trace back all the way to the Arab Spring, and also later on this Libya civil war. After Libya civil war, and then you see our Djibouti, this logistic military base, has been eventually set up. So which means now fully understand, decision makers fully understand now the economic issue, BRI, all those issues cannot be separated from those security issue at all. Otherwise, all those BRI projects maybe will be wiped away if the war's going on there. Yeah, even now, some projects in Ukraine, those BRI projects in Ukraine also has been bombed, has been destroyed. You know, factories, yeah, some underground, those tubes. So anyhow, so those idea, I think, has been changed given those events happening, and now gradually. But of course, we don't want to say like fill in all those security vacuum now made by the U.S. Saying now they withdraw, we immediately get in to fill in the so-called vacuum. That will be a silly way. Like we all know, the Afghanistan, that's a tomb for those great powers, one by one, through the Union. So anyhow, this is a cautiously moving forward, trying to develop some kind of a balancing the way. For one hand, maintaining our security stability, our investment and our talk access with all those countries involved.
And citizens as well, right? Chinese citizens. I know several thousand, 30,000, I think, had to be evacuated from Libya. And that, I think, was
yes, that's right. Yeah, 40,000.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. He. Amr, let me turn to you and ask you, I know you can jump in on any of this, but I'm very interested in your take on, you mentioned, for example, that the Chinese position of neutrality as it's perceived in the Middle East on Ukraine was an attractive one for other countries. You mentioned the economics and trade, which is attractive. How do countries in your view, countries in the region, is there a desire for China to play a greater diplomatic and security role in the region, especially as the United States moves to try to do offshore balancing, as Bill Hari talked about?
Yes, I see this kind. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, that was for Amr.
You're welcome to go ahead.
No. If we follow Paul's, order. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
you so much. Right. So let me respond quickly by saying yes. We can classify Middle Eastern countries, Paul, in two groups. A group which has traditionally tried to engage China more with regard to Middle Eastern conflicts. This group has included countries like Algeria, Egypt, pre-Arab Spring, Libya, Syria, and so on and so forth. And this group still has two active diplomatic powers in the Middle East, Algeria and Egypt, and they continue to push for greater Chinese engagement. A second group, which has been traditionally allied to the US, including Israel, including Saudi Arabia, including the United Arab Emirates. And what's new and what we're seeing again, the backdrop of the Russian war on Ukraine, is that this group of traditional US allies is also pushing for greater Chinese engagement. So by all means, Middle Eastern countries are not only looking for more Chinese investment, more of the Chinese activities related to the Belt and Road Initiative, which my colleague has just referenced. Not only Chinese, greater Chinese economic cooperation, China building smart cities in Egypt, for example, the new administrative capital city, or other big projects in Saudi Arabia, in Algeria, in Morocco. No, they would like to engage China more with regard to security issues. So from a Middle Eastern perspective, that is the attractiveness of the Chinese position of neutrality vis-a-vis the perceived neutrality vis-a-vis the Russian war on Ukraine. And again, the backdrop of the US decreasing its role, and I wouldn't say retreating, decreasing its role, a greater push is coming out from the region to engage China more in security and in political issues. Now, keep in mind, Paul, that this region has had a history of managing great power competition since the 1950s and 1960s. If we take after the Second War, after the Great War time, this region knows its diplomacy. It knows very well how to hedge its bets. Its diplomacy knows very well how to engage great powers in their competition over natural resources, over oil, over strategic assets in the region. And they sometimes push for greater engagement. They pushed back in the 1950s and 1960s and 70s, the US and Soviet Union, for greater engagement in the region. I would be interested, and first of all, keeping in mind we're only seeing the beginnings of it, it would be great to keep in mind analytically whether we would be seeing a similar push from regional countries to involve China in Middle Eastern conflicts, not to replace the US by China, but to get China to be part of the equation of the search for new security arrangements. Let me highlight two more additional points. It's important to keep in mind that there is a clear political background. As Bilahari was saying, Middle Eastern countries, autocratic governments in the region do not like to be lectured on human rights and do not like to be lectured on human rights, even in times of economic hardship. And economic hardship is increasing in the region for different reasons. China seems like a safe bet. Engaging China more does not bring in a greater engagement on human rights, does not bring in greater engagement on domestic politics. It's primarily focused on economic and trade and maybe security arrangements. So this political background needs to be kept in mind. China is an ally to governments in the region, no matter what their political nature is, autocratic or democratic, based on free and fair elections and rule of law, or less so. Final point I would like to highlight as well, and it's key to keep in mind that while the US perceived a decreased role in the region is alarming for a country like Israel, is alarming for Saudi Arabia, for the UAE, for Egypt, for the traditional allies. What is emerging in the region is not only bring in China or bring in Russia, and Bilahari's point on the performance of the Russians in Ukraine needs to be kept in mind from a Middle Eastern perspective. What's emerging as well is an attempt to figure out regional security arrangements. The Abraham Accords represent a step in this direction. A recent summit which happened in Israel, in Najaf, in Arabic Naqab, did indicate that search in the region from North Africa to the Levant to the Gulf to include Israel in emerging security arrangements, which are designed to fill the vacuum emerging due to the decreased US role. Can China be a component? Maybe. It's a Middle Eastern wish. What will happen needs to be seen. But let's just keep in mind that with the growing economic and trade and military ties, security arrangements can no longer be ignored. So I dare say that China is bound to have a greater role in the region in its security arrangements, which will go hand in hand with its increased economic, trade, and strategic role and projection of soft power. A colleague of mine at Stanford just finished a great paper on the projection of Chinese soft power, on the role of Chinese cultural centers in the region, and how China is presenting itself as a power of world peace, of neutrality, of non-alignment, and that appeals to many in the region.
Thank you, Amr. I'm going to go, that was terrific. And I want to go back to Bilahari on some of this. You and Dr. He both talked about the reluctance of China to get involved on security issues. Hasn't been, great for countries in the region, countries outside of the region to go in and get involved in security issues. Hasn't turned out so well in many cases. China has learned many lessons. But what I hear Amr saying is there may be a demand element to this, kind of pulling China in. And so even though they're reluctant, they may get pulled into some of these regional security arrangements. I want to get your perspective on that, but also help us understand this global security initiative President Xi unveiled at the Boao Forum. How important is this in your view? And does it have any bearing on the discussion we're having tonight?
Well, let me answer your last part of your question first about the new security initiative, right? Frankly, I don't know. It seemed to be a lot of old wine in a new bottle, but it may be something more, I don't know. But perhaps Dr. He should answer that, right? But let me answer your question. I think I'll make 2 points. It has struck me over the last, well, minus the last 2 years when I haven't been able to travel, right? Say the last 7 years or so before that, traveling around the Middle East, including Israel, there is a lot of interest in China, which is not matched by a lot of knowledge about China. Right? And that's true of Israel too. Although it's somewhat better in Israel than in other Middle Eastern countries. A lot of interest, a lot of expectation, but not too much knowledge about China. And that's a factor to be brought in mind, because they may want to bring China in, but do they know how to do it? They don't know how to deal with China. And more important, does China want to be brought in? In what way does China want to be brought in? I agree that it is probably inevitable as your economic and diplomatic footprint grows. China's economic and diplomatic footprint grows. A bigger political and security role is probably inevitable. But what kind of political and security role? What is China prepared to stomach? How far is it prepared to go? Now, these are questions without answers, and I'm not sure even the Chinese know at this present. These are some things that can be confronted only when you have to confront them, when something happens and you have to respond. The other point I want to make is that I don't wish to sound condescending. In our part of the world, East Asia in particular, Southeast Asia, you can maintain stability through deterrence by signaling, by military exercises, by political signaling, by military signaling. But in the Middle East, things are much more zero-sum. Now and then you have to shed blood to maintain deterrence, to maintain stability. I hope some kind of regional security architecture that is inclusive, not just of the states of the region, but of the major powers. Something that along the lines, I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, of the East Asia Forum, which has ASEAN at its core, but it has all the major powers participating, right? I don't think that's possible in the Middle East at present, because as I told you, the issues are always much more zero-sum in the Middle East, and usually end in blood, if not tears. But I think that's the way to go. These are very tentative moves. The meeting in the Negev Desert recently, which our colleague referred to, the overtures that Turkey is making to repair relationships, the not so secret talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and all these things. But whether they will amount to something in the end, I don't know. Now, come back to the Chinese point. I think China has a role to play, but what that role will be is only going to be determined by events. Because I think even if you can penetrate to the deep inner councils of the Politburo Standing Committee, they may not themselves know right now. I think they want to play a role, but the parameters of that role, who knows?
Thank you. I do want to turn to Dr. He on this global security initiative. There's a lot of interest. Is there anything, is it important? I mean, is this something we should pay attention to? Is it, a new vision for global security that is an alternative to what we're seeing from the United States and others? And does it apply to the Middle East?
Yeah, of course, it's very important because Paul mentioned twice, and then until now, not get the answer. So definitely important. But I think it's not saying this is the first thing from Xi Jinping. Even though he made this in the Boa conference, actually, this is I think all this idea has been repeatedly saying in at least a couple of years. That is called general security, the vision. We also call in Chinese in 总体安全可持续安全观, called general sustainable this comprehensive security point of view. So we cannot divide it. We're using this kind of thing to apply, to analyze what's happening in this Ukraine crisis, because the security concern now has been separated, not put in, in a comprehensive way. Any security only applied by one party, and then definitely will lead to the end, the end road, because you haven't taken into consideration about another parties, their security concern. So that's this idea used to analyze this Ukraine and the Russian, their security concern. For the Ukraine, they think they have to join the NATO, and for the Russia, that's impossible. We have to, defeated this kind of move. And also this comprehensive security point of view also bring in the harmonious nature between human being and our earth. That is green sustainable development. So we have been talking about this general security view also many years, I think, when we talk about how to fight with this climate change, because that's ended in also disaster, like those extremist weather and extremely hot, and then the climate change caused a lot of also disaster. So that's another security. Yeah, not only war, those war goes on, and also about nature. So that's a very big concept. Yeah, comprehensive point of view, and then there's a sustainable point of view, and also in bottom of the heart, that is security development is the final key for resolving all those security concern. Yeah, terrorist issue and extremist thoughts, fundamental thinking. So only the economic development is the general key. I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi mentioned this when he traveled the Middle East country. So he also put forward this idea. That's
Great.
China's thinking. Always focus on economic development, because that goes to the root causes for all those troubles.
Thank you very much. We've got just a few minutes left, and I did promise to go to some of the audience questions, and so I'm going to turn to them. We have one that came in, Amr. This one I think is to you. You mentioned the rise in food prices, wheat, as a result of the war in Ukraine. The war has also led to rising oil prices. What impact will the rise in oil prices have on Middle East geopolitics? And will oil producers get more leverage in their relations with China and the United States?
This is a great question. I'm a big fan of clustering the Middle East. So I always try to find clusters. So when you look at the impacts, economic impacts of the Russian war on Ukraine, we can cluster the region in two groups. One is oil exporting countries, which are beneficiaries of, to put it in a crude manner, which are benefiting economically from the crisis. Increased oil prices are creating better economic leverage, better trade leverage, better geopolitical leverage. Paul, you referenced the tensions between the US on the one hand and Saudi and the UAE on the other hand, and the ability of Saudis and Emirati officials to say no to American requests to increase oil production. And the diplomatic and oil-related game which is going on right now should not be understood as a linear game which the US dictates. It's actually everything else but that. So in a way, we have a first group, a first cluster of countries which are the oil exporting countries benefiting from the crisis, and they are benefiting economically, and they are benefiting regionally in the sense of projecting their soft power once again in the region. So the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have just pledged billions in economic and trade and financial assistance, to Egypt, for example. The second group are countries which are non-oil exporting, oil importing, or oil non-exporting countries, which are approaching economic hardship, are in tough economic times due to increased food prices, due to high inflation rates, due to their need for financial injections, not only from the Gulf, but also from the IMF and from global creditors in the US and Europe primarily. This second group of countries is out there looking for economic assistance, for financial assistance, and they look to China as well. They're not only looking to the Gulf and not only looking to the global creditors in the US and Europe, not only to the IMF, but they're looking to China. Recent moves from the Egyptian government and visits between Egyptian and Chinese officials have indicated exactly this urge on the Egyptian side to bring China in economically as an assisting power, not only as an investing power, but as a power of economic assistance. Now, does this impact geopolitics in the region? Yes, of course, but here too, it's too early to say. We're approaching tough times, food insecurity, rising inflation rates, rising food prices, again, in the backdrop of this clustering of the region, beneficiaries, net winners and net losers.
Thank you very much. We've got a question, one for Bilahari and then one for Dr. Hood to close us out at the end. Bilahari, this is an easy question for you. Of course, I'm being facetious. This is a pretty big question, but given the situation in Ukraine, given the strikingly different visions of global order that you see between the United States on one hand, Russia, China on the other, and given the divisions that seem to be breaking out over the Ukraine war, are we leading to a situation where the world will divide into blocks, with China and Russia on one hand and those that follow their narrative, and the United States, Europe, countries in Asia on the other hand?
I think we should not exaggerate the prospect of that happening. The strategic competition between US and China is fundamentally different from the old strategic Cold War competition between the US and the Soviet Union. Why? Because the US and the Soviet Union led two fundamentally different systems, connected only tangentially, and the competition was between systems. China and the US and Russia and Europe and all of us, including Singapore, are part of one global system, right? Connected by supply chains of a scope, of a complexity, of a density never before seen in history, right? So we are competing. If there's a competition, it's a competition within a system. And that's fundamentally different from competition between systems. Now, all of us are invested to different degrees. For example, China is invested, far more invested in the current system than Russia, right? Because China has been one of the principal beneficiaries of this system, right? And I don't think this system is going to bifurcate no matter what. All of us have certain reservations about the system, but we're all part of it, whether we like it or not. So the short answer to that question is no, I don't think it's gonna happen.
Terrific, thank you. Dr. He, we're gonna end with you. Question about a recent article that you wrote talking about Saudi Arabia may begin to price oil exports using China's currency, the renminbi. The question here, how do you see the issue of the petro-yuan as opposed to the petrodollar playing out as China becomes increasingly engaged economically in the Middle East and as oil prices continue to rise? Should the US be concerned about US dollar dominance of the global petroleum market?
Yeah, the short answer is US, no need to worry about that. No need, because even though there is some trend saying now some yuan will be replaced the dollar in some certain part of this oil trade, those contracts, but it's just the minimal. Minimal is not a big deal at all. It will take a long time saying to kick off the US, this dollar dominance, this position. But anyhow, we all know this Russian, Ukraine, this war, and eventually come up with this, financial sanction on Russia, and also shift the system also has been cut off. So that, raised somehow this importance of the dollar to some extent. Yeah, if you look about our exchange rate between RMB, yuan, and dollar, you will see. Just 2 months ago, it's a 6.3, RMB exchange for $1, but now it's 6.7 exchange for $1. So actually, I think, but anyway, even India now is talking about how to trade with Russia, this oil in ruby and ruble, and many other countries also thinking that way, because those countries, they are rely on those fuel, those gas or oil from Russia, because Russia has been cut off this dollar trade, and then there's no other way to maintain those trade. So this is a very tricky issue. two sides in one coin. This one side of that coin is United States is doing the thing, push other country to de-link with this dollar system, by US itself. But on the other hand of this coin, it is now he wants to get all those countries back into this dollar-dominated system. So those things are push and pull. Both has been done, I think, by United States itself. So I think, the answer is no need to worry for US. That's just a trend. We see there's some little trend, but still a long way to go.
Thank you, Wenping. Well, we've hit our time. I think we could go on for some time. I feel we've scratched the surface on some issues, but I want to thank Amr Hamzawi from the Carnegie Endowment, coming in from California, Bilahari Kazakin from here in Singapore. Thank you for joining us tonight. And He Wenping, thank you for joining us from Beijing and offering your insights and perspectives. And to everyone watching, thank you for spending your time with us. Thank you for asking questions. Hope you got some of the questions answered. Be sure to check out Carnegie China's website for more research, and check out China in the World podcast as well on your podcast app of choice. Thank you again to our audience and our participants. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.